Decolonizing AI, the shift to pluralistic architecture. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the hidden cultural and technical fracture lines running right beneath the surface of our global AI revolution. You know, we so often think of large language models as these completely universal, omniscient global brains. But today, we're going to peel that back. We're going to look at the very specific, highly localized DNA actually built into these systems, and we'll explore the fascinating social and technical movements working to build a truly pluralistic AI architecture. Look, current large language models are incredibly powerful, but one of our sources describes the situation so perfectly. They said, it's brilliant, it's also wearing cargo shorts and flip-flops to everyone else's wedding. It's just such a great visual, right? Because these models have what you might call a distinct Western accent. And I don't just mean the language they speak, I'm talking about their underlying cultural assumptions, their sense of humor, and their moral compass. It's overwhelmingly calibrated to a very specific Silicon Valley worldview. So we really have to ask ourselves, why is our purportedly global AI so culturally tone-deaf? How did this global brain end up with such a localized, specific, and honestly sometimes insensitive worldview? This really matters to all of us because as these technologies seep into global healthcare, education, and basic infrastructure, our sources argue that these cultural biases aren't just minor bugs anymore. They're becoming deeply embedded structural features. Okay, let's look at a perfect story from the source material that really brings this to life. Someone asked an AI to write a heartfelt retirement speech for an Indonesian father. Now, the model delivered a speech with absolutely perfect grammar, soaring metaphors, real Hallmark-style polish. But it completely failed the cultural assignment. It totally missed the gentle teasing wrapped in reverence, the heavy weight of unspoken pride, and that specific Javanese shorthand for love where you never actually explicitly say, I love you. And this right here brilliantly illustrates a core issue researchers keep pointing out. The internet's dominant English language assumptions clash intensely with high-context collectivist frameworks. Whether we're talking about the African philosophy of Ubuntu or the Japanese concept of wa, which prioritizes harmony way above ego, a model that's trained predominantly on Western individualism can easily spit out advice that feels totally alien or even outright offensive to the global majority. Let's move on to our next section, the general alignment ceiling, the limits of single-objective AI. You see, this cultural mismatch isn't just a language problem. It's actually rooted in a deep mathematical flaw in how we train these models. It's a process known as general alignment, and it is fundamentally hit a structural ceiling. Here's the deal with general alignment. It assumes we can somehow compress wildly conflicting human values, like, say, being helpful to a user versus keeping the system perfectly secure, into a single scalar reward. It's literally like trying to squish a complex three-dimensional shape into a flat two-dimensional shadow. Mathematically, this flattens out all the nuanced trade-offs. It forces the model to just average out values, rather than respecting them as distinct hard boundaries. And this mathematical ceiling has massive real-world costs. Our sources highlight a study where GitHub Copilot generated exploitable security vulnerabilities in 40% of test cases. 40%. Because the model couldn't figure out how to balance the competing objectives of being helpful by generating the code and being harmless by keeping it secure, it just exhibited pathological behaviors, like inappropriately copying vulnerabilities or completely ignoring the broader context. Or consider the famous case of Google Bard's hallucination about the James Webb Space Telescope. During a huge promotional demo, the AI confidently misattributed the very first images of an exoplanet to the JWST. This wasn't just some minor, quirky glitch. It was a confident error born from a structural flaw. And get this, it wiped out $100 billion in Alphabet's market value in a single day. That $100 billion mistake? That is a textbook example of uncertainty blindness. When a generally aligned AI faces ambiguity or hits a gap in its training data, instead of hitting pause, expressing caution, or just asking a clarifying question, its training literally incentivizes it to just guess, and guess assertively. It completely lacks the cognitive agency to simply tell you, hey, I actually don't know. All right, next section, from fair to care data, redefining data ownership. To fix these really deep-seated flaws, both the cultural erasure and those technical blind spots we just talked about, indigenous scholars and technologists argue we have to rethink the absolute foundation of AI, and that is the data ecosystems feeding these models. Because right now, the global push for AI data looks an awful lot like extraction. For a long time, the open data movement really pushed the FAIR principles, which stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Now, that sounds great, but many communities point out a glaring omission. FAIR focuses heavily on making data incredibly easy to share and extract, but critics argue it completely ignores the historical contexts and the massive power imbalances between global tech giants and local communities. So instead, indigenous data sovereignty movements are proposing the CARE principles. The idea here is that data ecosystems must generate collective benefit. They need to empower indigenous authority and self-determination. They must mandate responsibility from the people actually using the data, and they have to prioritize ethics, specifically ethics that don't just paint local cultures as having a deficit. It's a massive shift from simply sharing data to actively protecting the very people that data comes from. Moving to our next point, African AI self-determination, breaking extractive relationships. This push for data sovereignty is forming the absolute backbone of some powerful AI self-determination movements across the African continent right now. We are seeing a major pushback against top-down tech development. Local technologists and thinkers are pointing out something pretty heavy. Relying on external powers for AI infrastructure, while those exact same powers extract raw data and cheap labor for content annotation, well, it mirrors historical colonialism almost exactly. Data has basically become the new cash crop of the fourth industrial revolution. Guided by the philosophies of scholars like Walter Rodney, organizations across Africa like the Masakane Collective are taking real action. They are explicitly rejecting what they call parachute research. That's when external researchers drop in, extract knowledge or data, and just leave without providing any tangible benefit or ownership back to the local community. Instead, they're demanding we break these dependent relationships and start building AI on their own terms. Okay, so what's the fix? Taking edge alignment seriously, the architecture of pluralistic AI. Let's explore the technical solution our sources outline to actually address these systemic problems. It's a total paradigm shift, and it's called edge alignment. Edge alignment totally ditches the idea of building one beige average case global model. Instead, it requires a 3-layer adaptation framework to properly decolonize large language models and make them genuinely locally relevant. Let's break down these 3 steps. Step 1 is the cultural engine, and this means moving way beyond simple vocabulary translation. We have to actually train models on local literature, folklore, and hyper-regional nuances. For example, an AI in Africa needs to learn from Swahili rap battles and village decision-making structures, not just translated Oxford English. It needs to know local legends just as well as it knows George Washington. Next up is layer 2, the context layer. Because culture isn't just what we say, right? It's how we behave. The AI must actually learn the behavioral psychology of a region. It needs to know exactly when to use indirect phrasing in high-context cultures to preserve harmony. It needs to know when silence is actually the correct, face-saving answer in certain East Asian contexts. When an AI respects those invisible social rules, user trust absolutely skyrockets. And the final layer is governance. This recognizes that a one-size-fits-all ethical framework just doesn't work globally. Edge alignment proposes modular, plug-and-play governance models. A system operating in the EU obviously needs to prioritize individual privacy under GDPR. But a model in China might optimize for social stability, India for data sovereignty, while many African nations might prioritize community rights and agricultural leapfrogging. So when you compare the 2 approaches side by side, the leap from general to edge alignment is profound. We move from mathematically squishing values into a single scalar reward to using vector multi-objective optimization that actually respects conflicting constraints. We move from an average case consensus that essentially erases minorities to diverse pluralistic representation. And crucially, we move from static, assertive guessing to dynamic negotiation, where the AI can finally say, hold on, let me ask a clarifying question. Which leaves us with a final, incredibly crucial question to ponder today. As the sources remind us, culture isn't just noise getting in the way of the data, it literally is the data. So as we transition into this new era of pluralistic, self-determined AI architectures, whose values, whose history, and whose soul are we actually building into the machine? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this changes how you look at the AI tools you use every single day.